So Dr. Kristine Hickle, she's our academic consultant, as I said before, for our UK chapter, and she's a senior lecturer in social work and social care at the University of Sussex. So, Kristine.
Hello, thanks for having me. So for the Americans, a senior lecturer is a bit like an associate professor. We like to have our own special language here. So I am not English, but I've lived here. I got all my degrees from Arizona State University. So I'm a sort of lifelong Sun Devil.
I was a Sun Devil on the line.
Yes, indeed. The English don't have like university teams like that. So when I moved here, I was like, well, are we? What is our mascot? I didn't know that wasn't a thing, but I've learned. I've lived here for 7 years now. My research is very much kind of embedded in the research and practice that I do here. So I'm going to talk, I think, for about 10, 15 minutes. And I know that oftentimes you all hear from grantees and from people in practice. So I'm just going to sort of talk a little bit about what I'm learning from practice I feel like is relevant, and also just give a sense for those of you who maybe don't hear from other academic consultants very often about hopefully what we kind of bring to the role. Kathy, you can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. There we go. So this is quite small on the screen if your screen is small, but I want to just briefly give a little bit of information about, I think, the UK context. So we know that whilst we have a perhaps more robust welfare state even than in the US, there are still over 3 million children that are living in poverty. We know that each year about 73,000 recorded sexual offenses happen against children. Of course, we know that that recorded number is far an underestimation, that if the average age of a child being sexually abused is about 9, and the average age of a disclosure of that experience is oftentimes decades later, that is a vast underestimation. Right now, we have about 50,000 children who are looked after by their local authority, which is a sort of another way of saying that they're in the care of child protection, that the state is essentially their corporate parent as a result of abuse and neglect. And we have seen that number kind of steadily increase year on year for the past several. We know, despite some disputes in relation to institutional racism, that minoritized children, young people are disproportionately excluded from school. And that was a really important issue in my area of research in criminal and sexual exploitation, and they are disproportionately involved in the youth justice system. And according to quite recent reports from the Office of the Children's Commissioner, there are an estimated 27,000 children who identify as gang members. Now, the map on the left of the screen there is a map of county lines drug supply routes. So if you're not in the UK, the term county lines doesn't mean a lot, but it is quite a specific probably more English than anything else term that refers to a very particular drug supply model that is become quite problematic in the UK for a number of reasons that I won't go into. But if you think about the kind of vast network you see there of drug running, and the 27,000 children that are getting affiliated, the possibility for their vulnerability to becoming criminally and sexually exploited is quite significant. So there are a number of issues to tackle. Next slide. Now, the facts, if you will, the stats I have on this slide are again from the UK, but I think they reflect a wider picture of the impact of COVID. So those children and young people that I've just referenced in the slide previously, that are probably our most vulnerable in society, have become, we know already, increasingly more vulnerable as a result of the pandemic. So there was already a process of widening inequality. And then if you were at the point the pandemic hit, already living in a place where there was overcrowded, poor quality living conditions, that's only exacerbated by being in a pandemic, by perhaps food insecurity, by parents' jobs insecurity, by an environment where homeschooling perhaps isn't conducive. I had to do quite a bit of homeschooling myself this year. And you know what? It was a sufficiently conducive environment, and it was still pretty crap most of the time. So, and pretty stressful. And I don't ever want to learn about steam train engines and go over fractions again in my life, right? So it's a stressful environment. It's made more stressful for those children in really difficult living environments. And a widening, of course, as a result of that, we know a widening education gap. If you've experienced domestic abuse, food insecurity, and kind of other traumatic stressors on top of just trying to be in school, then it's going to make the possibility that you might actually have engaged with that online learning so much more difficult. We also know, and this is part of my area of research, is the impact of childhood trauma on kind of life chances, on developing trajectories. That if you experience a lot of prior trauma, so those kids who, again, oftentimes are receiving services from HFC grantees, they've experienced a whole range of prior traumas, kind of chronic, perhaps, trauma in their life. Adding a pandemic on top of it and those extra stressors means that you're that much less able to manage, right? Most of us, if we've had a really difficult week and then something else difficult happens on top of it, our capacity to manage that difficulty is significantly reduced. And our capacity to bounce back, and now that we're back in school and things are back normal and we can go to friends' birthday parties and to the skate park or whatever else, our capacity just to sort of rejoin society and to be okay again is going to be reduced, and we're going to need more time and more help in order to get to that good place. And then finally, again, this is really relevant to my own area of research, is that children who have experienced intrafamilial, so kind of familial abuse, or extrafamilial harm, have been isolated from observant protective adults. So a teacher is not seeing that you're showing up and have a difficult time at home. That youth worker hasn't been available to kind of hang out at the park with. Those services that you might have attended, where those protective adult eyes are watching and seeing what's going on and noticing, haven't necessarily been there. All right, next slide. So these are the kind of challenges that are facing the services that HFC grantees are trying to tackle. But those two slides are quite depressing. I want to kind of take a message from one of my own research participants, that, so often what helping professionals are trying to do is to offer hope and a route out, right? They're trying to find ways, creative ways of helping people out. So I'm just going to spend a couple minutes talking about again, from my own research, I do a lot of participatory kind of practice near research with young people, with parents and professionals. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the skills and practices that really good professionals are using, because that's been the best part of research, is hearing when things are happening that are good. When things are happening that feel productive and helpful and healing, and are helping people to move forward. And it's the kind of stuff that I bring into conversations with grantees when I'm wondering how it is that they evaluate their work and what are they seeing that's happening that's helpful. I'm trying to look at my notes here. Where am I at? So a lot of the work I'm doing right now, and I'm going to talk about a couple of projects, is with young people who have been sexually and criminally exploited. And one of the really kind of challenges for that group of young people is that oftentimes, if they're being exploited or trafficked, so when I say exploited, oftentimes in outside the UK, we would use the term traffic almost as synonymously, is that when professionals engage with them, whether that's police, social workers, therapists, counselors, they engage with them in a way that really mirrors the behavior of abusers. So think about this. If an abuser says, you have to go here, you have to wear this, don't talk to these people, do what I say, or there will be consequences. Then a professional notices that they're being exploited or trafficked, pulls them out of that situation, and then says to them, go here, don't wear that, you can't talk to them, do what I say, or there will be consequences, right? And that feels exploitative to that young person. And they are right about that, right? This is oftentimes the service context that young people in those situations end up in do not meet their needs and further traumatize them. And that young people themselves in research have pointed this out. If their abusers are untrustworthy, why should they trust professionals when they have behaved in quite similar ways? So this problem, and this is the kind of crux of a lot of the research I'm doing right now, is that the system is often not well designed to meet the needs of adolescents, of teenagers. And that oftentimes professionals' responses come from a place of anxiety. So if they know that they're going to get in trouble when all of a sudden these kids go missing, when they're in harm's way, when I do research with practitioners, the level of harm that young people are experiencing in these contexts means they're worried they might not live, right? They're worried that they might die over the weekend. That they are going to themselves be caught up in a gang fight that means they're the ones that kill someone else, right? So this is a high level of anxiety for professionals just to be in the midst of. But then of course, when we're in that place, we make sometimes knee-jerk decisions, right? We don't think calmly, and we don't think about what that young person really needs in that situation. So in addition to kind of seeking out young people's views and experiences, I've sought out oftentimes the views of professionals and kind of what they're doing, what they think is working, and what they're getting right. Next slide. I want to give an example of that and what that looks like from a piece of research that I did. And I think when I'm thinking about kind of what I might bring to you, this example I've just written about for a book chapter on trauma and attachment. And it feels like it's the kind of work that oftentimes social workers in kind of traditional social work roles don't get to do. And it's the kind of work that a lot of the charity partners that you fund do get to do. So this is Sam's story. Sam's about 17 when I met him. He was adopted as a baby, and he lived with his adopted parents until about the age of 15, when it became really apparent that a long undetected history of neglect at his home had really meant that he was continuously going missing from his home. And he was starting to seek out getting his needs met by adults who were sexually exploiting him in his community. When his adoptive parents, refused to let him come home after a missing episode, the extent of the neglect he'd been experiencing at their home became really clear, and he was taken into social worker care. He was removed from his home. His social worker, Anne, is someone who I knew quite well from a range of research encounters, and what she had to say about them is that they were horrendous to him, there was no warmth there, and that they were constantly blaming of him for everything. They just neglected him on an absolutely massive scale. And she said it was atrocious. So Sam spent several months in a children's home, but really kind of struggled to manage his feelings, right? As you might imagine. He said, he told me I had anger issues, and I just kept knocking people out, decking people, losing my temper, putting my fist through walls, fist through windows, TV's broken, because when I lash out, I don't stop. So by that point, when he was really about to blow out of that group home, his biological father kind of surfaced, and he was really eager to connect with him, as you might, right? I can imagine what that would be like, and that would be what I wanted to do. And he was really looking for a way out of the children's home at that point anyway. So he lived with his dad for a year, but the placement eventually broke down. His father really struggled with the challenging behaviors that come from the kind of life he had lived. And he struggled with some of the learning difficulties that he had and just from the impact of his traumatic childhood. So, during kind of long visits, his social worker would go up and it was quite across the country where the social worker was and where he was currently living. She made these long visits to him. And when that placement broke down, she worked to kind of quickly find supported accommodation for him, because he's getting a bit older at that point. He got angry with her. He refused to work with her, and yet she persevered. And the time that she kind of gave to that relationship was made possible by lower caseloads in her team. Now, this is very rare in traditional social work settings. It was a decision made that because adolescents are more complex to work with, they needed that extra time. But oftentimes in so many localities, and that's not the case, the charities that are the kinds that you all fund are the ones that step in and say, actually, we will do that work. We will do that intensive, flexible, persistent work to build that relationship. So that her work with Sam continued to be characterized by a lot of persistence. And I'm kind of pulling the story together from both interviewing her and him. And she had a real understanding of his behaviors as really being about his best efforts to stay safe. She really cared about him. She said to me at one point, I'm quite happy to say to Sam, I absolutely love him to bits, and I do. I genuinely do. I just think that that's what allows you to affect any change in kids' lives, because if you don't really give a shit and you're just being paid, then you see them once every 6 weeks. And why should they invest anything in you? Why should they believe that you are really wanting to help them? You're just this random person in their life coming in and out, and they can sniff you out a mile off. And I think if there's anything that my research with teenagers has told me is that is the case, that you might have teenagers yourself, and you will know this from your own life experience. They can sniff out that inauthenticity and that lack of genuineness when you're a mile away still. Now, his own description, I'm almost done with my story here, of his relationship with Anne, kind of several years later, so they knew each other for quite a long time, confirmed the strength of their relationship. And he said, no one can do this job if you don't care, because every kid will look at you and they'll say, nah, go away. Being real, I've told social workers that. I've told Anne to F off. There was other swear words I did edit for you, because I know you're being recording and all that. But Anne was like, no, I'm still worried about this kid. She's still thinking about me after work and seeing, Anne will make sure you know that where you're living, you're getting the right stuff and everything's going correct, not going wrong. That's what Anne would do. So his current placement is the most stable he's ever been. She's advocating really hard for him to stay in a place where he's got really great supports. He has a kind of care worker that sees him regularly and is teaching him stuff like how to manage money, how to cook, how to fix a bike, how to not punch walls when you're mad, all the kinds of stuff that he would get from a caring parent in his life. And she really feels like those relationships were the things that have kept him from spiraling. When I asked Sam at the end of my interview with him what some of his strengths are, which is kind of always how I end an interview with a teenager. And he said, I'm strong and determined. Everyone said that I'm really brave and I've come a long way. Like my social worker's always saying, I've come a long way. And it's about having the right people around you when you're surviving it. Next slide. So Sam's story has kind of really stuck with me because I think that last bit about having the right people around you when you're surviving it has been really key. Right now, I'm doing a really interesting piece of research with colleagues at Sussex and other universities where we're looking at innovation in children's social care and how it is that any organization, whether that's a charity, a kind of nonprofit, a social worker, police, whoever that might be, how is it that they engage with the barriers and facilitators of innovation and change when they're working with young people experiencing these very complex risks. Anne and Sam's relationship was quite unique, and part of that was because her relationship with him was really trauma informed. It was flexible, and she was kind of supported by her manager to be responsive and to advocate on his behalf. So a lot of what we're finding even in the early stages of the research is about that. Is that responsivity, that capacity for flexibility, for holding risk and anxiety in the system, that's what needs to happen. And one of the things that, that we're sort of finding is that those organizations need the space and the funding to do that. So this kind of research, I've left a screenshot on of the website if you're interested in going to have a look at the types of innovation we're looking at. But that kind of learning from research is something I'm really excited to bring into this role because I'm going to be we're constantly learning from what works and bringing that in, involving some of the charity partners. So some of the UK grantees, we're telling them about this project. We're inviting them to be kind of a part of networks where they can learn from each other. And I think that's the sort of really useful dynamic between being in this role and jumping back and forth between academia and a consultancy role. The last two slides are very quick. Smita, do I have like 3 more minutes? Excellent. Okay, so next slide. So I've said a little bit about this already, about what works, but just to give you a kind of flavor for some of the things that we're finding. And part of it is also coming from another project that I'm leading on. It's a photography project with gang-involved young women in London. We're looking at the kind of experience of resisting and interpersonal violence, of self-preserving, of feeling strong. And so I'm also bringing quite a lot of new learning around creative practices into the role. But we're really starting to know what works with this group of young people is practice that's trauma informed, that really has a good understanding of that impact of early childhood trauma. Practice that's contextual, which is about not just expecting those young people to keep themselves safe, but expecting adults to keep the environments they're in safe. Oftentimes, traditionally, we've told that sexually exploited kid, oh, you're being exploited by bad adults at the mall. You can't go to the mall anymore. When what we should be doing is saying, how do we keep the mall safe? Because you know what? Teenagers like to go to the mall, and you should be able to go to the mall. So we're going to keep that mall safe. We're going to keep that park safe. We're going to work with that local, off-license, shop, and we're going to see what that shopkeeper can do to keep kids safe. That we know that services that are flexible and persistent, and this I think is really, again, the joy of seeing really good charities supported through HFC is that they're the ones that can do that. One of the London grantees does some really great work that I've seen where they're the ones that show up with parents and kids and explain the system and debrief with them and show up at school if they need and pick them up for things and help them fill out forms. They're doing some of that flexible, persistent work that is the necessary work that happens. And it's work that's intersectional. So it's engaging with the multiple forms of disadvantage that a child might be experiencing. It doesn't see them just as their race or their gender or their sexual orientation, but sees perhaps the intersection of those disadvantages together and recognizes that the whole person needs to be helped. All right, last slide, I think. So here's a good example, the charity I just referenced already, but I wanted to just kind of end with this kind of very tangible example of how it is that HFC sort of immediately responded to some of those negative impacts of the pandemic that I referenced right at the beginning of my presentation. And this was to fund this winter engagement fund for Safer London. And this was something I really encouraged them to apply for, but they recognized that because of the lockdown restrictions, there wasn't a lot of inside meeting that was possible, and yet they wanted to still be able to engage young people. And they recognized, all right, the barriers are things like not having a good winter coat, you need to have a winter coat to meet outside, not having the right technology. So do you not have mobile phone data? Do you not have internet service in your home? Do you not have a piece of tech that we can communicate on because you need that? Is the only person offering you a technology a perpetrator, right? We want to be able to break that connection. We want to be able to say, actually, you can receive that support elsewhere. You don't need them for that. And even things occasionally like food, like travel, and just the stuff that doesn't create a barrier to continued engagement. So I think something like that that's so tangible and immediate is has a really lasting impact on their capacity to keep those young people connected and protected and engaged. All right, I think that's my last slide. Is there one more? That's it. I just wanted to open it up to questions for you about whether that's the research or I don't know, anything else that might have come up for you in my brief presentation.
How did that kid get braces?
So that's a picture from Safer London's website. That was probably just straight off the internet, whatever. But it's possible, well, it's possible they're eligible through the NHS. I'm not actually sure what teenagers are eligible for by a dental, but if they are perhaps a looked after child, so they're being taken care of by the state, that's probably covered through NHS.
Just curious, because I just went through that with one of my grandkids, and yeah, you know, that's a whole thing in and of itself, is getting the care to actually make that happen and stick with it over the months and months that you have to do that.
Absolutely. And recognizing the importance for things like that, right? That, you know, having
Exactly.
great, feeling good about yourself is really
Yeah, it's really important. That was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, that was, Dr. Hickle, that was terrific. Thank you. And kind of sitting here in the U.S., it's great to get more acquainted, you know, with not just your research and obviously the critical role you play for HFC as a bridge in many ways, but with you know, some of the on the ground grantees in your region and the great work that they do.
And Dean, just if I can just add, Kristine's been amazing to HFC in the UK, and I think you've just got a sense of that in her presentation.
Certainly did.
So, you know, I certainly on behalf of the board want to say a huge thank you to her for the work she does. It's really been helpful. But really what struck us, I love the way she finished with that last example. It just shows that even the simplest things, the pure simplicity of that winter program of how our money can make such a difference in quite the simplest ways, and particularly at a bit difficult time and over those cold months. It was extremely well received by Safer London. And so it doesn't, you know, it doesn't need to be anything particularly dramatic, but the difference we can make even at a very simple level is huge. So well done, Kristine. Thank you very much.
You know, Jack, just to add on to your point, and it's not specific to Europe in any way, but I had, it does show you how some of the things that appear to be, I don't want to use the word little, but less significant, how significant they actually are. I was at an event, it was some months ago, and I was talking to somebody who had been the recipient of working with one of our grantees, and this teenager told me just the ability to have kind of current modern clothes and to fit in, what a difference that made to kind of go to school looking like everyone else and feeling good about, you know, the jeans they're wearing. I don't know if it was jeans, but it does show you how significant And you know, Dr. Hickle, you know, everyone knows it better than me, how significant these themes that seemed less significant, they really are about self-esteem and feeling better about yourself.
And even beyond that, they're a way of kind of breaking the connection to potential perpetrators, you know, that actually you don't need someone who's trying to groom you with those items and to say, here's, you know, I can provide you with an identity and with purpose and with stuff. Actually, maybe you can feel good about yourself in other ways and through other kind of connections and support, and tangibly we can meet those outside, because that's oftentimes that's the kind of sticking point, is like, you know what, they're just teenagers at the end of the day. They just want the same stuff teenagers want. They don't have access to it. So, you know, what can we do to kind of, you know, ensure that they don't have that vulnerability to being exploited?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And Jack, thanks for the direction and leadership in Europe, and close connection, obviously, with with Dr. Hickle and our consultant there. Thank you.